one of the things that Maya and I found when we were writing this paper, we were looking at the discourse that precedes genocide in genocidal states. And the enhancement of a sense of victimization on the part of one of the groups, usually the group that's going to commit the genocide. First of all, their sense of being victims is much heightened by the demagogues who are trying to stir up this sort of hatred. So they basically say, look, you've been oppressed in a variety of ways, and these are the people who did it, and they're not going to stop doing it, and this time we're going to get them before they get us. It's something like that. So there's something very pathological about the enhancement of victimization.
Relevant?
Well, see, the problem as far as I'm concerned with it is it's not thought through very well. Because there's a point that's being made, and the point is that people have been oppressed and they suffer. And that's true, that point. But then the proper framework from within which to interpret that, I believe, is that that's characteristic of life. You can't take it personally in some sense. And you can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims. And you certainly can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims and then assume that you're only in the victim class and then assume that that gives you certain, like, access to certain forms of redress, let's say. It gets dangerous very rapidly if you do that sort of thing. So, for example, one of the things that characterized the Soviet Union, and this was particularly true in the 1920s, but afterwards, is so the Soviets were very much enamored of the idea of class guilt. So, for example, although it was only about 40 years previously that the serfs had been emancipated, they weren't much more than slaves, right? And so that was the bulk of the Russian population. They were bought and sold along with the land. So they had been emancipated, and some of them, many of them had turned into independent farmers, and some of them had become reasonably prosperous because, at least in principle, I presume a certain proportion of them from being crooked, but I presume a larger proportion from actually being able to raise food. And of course, at that time, the bulk of the Russian food population was produced by these relatively successful peasant farmers. And relatively successful would mean maybe they had a brick house or something, and maybe they had a couple of cows, and maybe they were able to hire a few people. And so, you know, it wasn't like they were massive landowners or anything. But I talked to you a little bit about the Pareto principle and the notion that in any domain of activity, a small proportion of people end up producing most of what's in that domain of activity. The same was true in Russia with regards to these peasant farmers. Some of them were extraordinarily efficient, and they produced most of Russia's food. When the communists came in, they described those landholders as parasites, essentially, predicated on the Marxist idea that if someone had extracted profit from an enterprise, that they had basically stolen that profit from the people, say, that they had employed or otherwise oppressed. And so you could be a member of the kulak, K-U-L-A-K, K-U-L-A-K. You could be a member of the kulak class. And then because you were a member of that class, you were automatically guilty. And so what happened was, and you got to think this through to really understand what happened. So what happened was the intellectual communists were sent out in cadres out into these little towns to find people who would help them round up the kulaks. Now you got to think about what a small town is like, because, so imagine you're in a town and there's 3 or 4 people or maybe 10 people or something like that who are a little more successful than everyone else. And a certain number of people are going to be fine with that and maybe even happy about it because they regard those people as particularly productive and, you know, as stalwart members of the community, regardless of their flaws. But there's going to be some people who are not happy about it at all, that are going to be very resentful about that and jealous.
Yes.
And so those are going to be people whose characters, I would say, are of the less positive type. And so when the intellectuals came in and described the reason that these people should be treated as parasites and profiteers, then it was the resentful minority in those towns, and that would be the kind of guy that hangs around in the bar all the time and is completely unconscientious and fails at everything and then blames everyone else for it. The intellectuals came in and said, this is unfair that this happened to you. You've actually been victimized, and now it's your opportunity to go have your revenge. And so that's exactly what happened. Now, in some of the villages, sometimes the peasants would actually surround the farmsteads of these more successful people and try to defend them, but that never worked out for very long. And so then these mobs, these angry mobs, would go into the farmhouses and strip the place right down to nothing. And they packed these people up and sent them on trains with no food out to Siberia, where there was no place to live. And so that they were packed into houses, you know, maybe they had a square meter each to live in, and all their children died of typhoid, and many of them froze to death. Many people died. Millions of people died as a consequence of the Dekulakization, at least as a consequence of its total effect. So what happened then was that there wasn't any food produced. And so then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death in the 1920s, which is something you never hear about, right? You never hear about that. Why do you never hear about that? That's a question worth asking. You know, it was an absolute catastrophe. They used to, so these people were starving, right to the point of cannibalism, right? I mean, it was ugly as anything you could possibly imagine. If you were a mother, and so you're supposed to hand all your grain into the central committee, mostly for distribution into the cities. You didn't get to keep any for yourself. And so maybe then afterwards, if you were a mother, you'd go out in the fields that had already been harvested, and you'd pick up individual grains of wheat. And if you didn't turn those in, that was death for you.
Yep.
So that's how far it was pushed. So that's a little story about how victimization, how the idea of victimization and perpetration can get out of hand extraordinarily rapidly. And so whenever people are beating the victim drum, you know, they'll cover that up with empathy, roughly speaking. We're speaking on behalf of the oppressed. It's like, maybe you are, but maybe you're no saint, because, you know, you're so sure that you're a saint and you're only speaking from the position of good. Highly unlikely.
Wow, that was a great clip. A lot of what he was describing there, I read about in The Gulag Archipelago Volume 1 by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was, of course, the famous Soviet dissident writer. I made a full hour-and-a-half video going through that book, analyzing all the passages I thought were worth analyzing and discussing the book as a whole. It's like an hour and a half. I'll leave a card and an end screen for it. But one of the things I talked about in that video, and what he's describing is, I made a video, I made a clip from that Gulag Archipelago review I made called Kulaks and White Supremacists. It details the whole story of what happened regarding the kulaks and how the Soviets, the authorities, made them out to be parasites and, members of the bourgeois state, and that needed to be rooted out. The term kulak began to expand. The meaning of it began to expand to the point where it meant anyone who owned anything, basically. And the original meaning of the term kulak, which was which initially meant like a greedy, landowner. That original meaning expanded to basically mean anyone who was who the state wanted to arrest and deport. And one of the things I say in this video I made, the Kulaks and White Supremacists, is that there are a lot of people on the political left, who would be the leftists of today, that have expanded the term white supremacist to mean anyone who is even remotely conservative, or anyone who is not down the line leftist. And, they just call everyone who disagrees with them basically white supremacists. It's a tool of dehumanization, and white supremacists are viewed as parasites in a lot of ways that need to be eradicated. And it's a very dangerous thing, that this changing of language and this, this victimhood politics that we have in our current day and age. It can lead to, what it led to in the past. But it's important to think about what Dr. Peterson said in this clip. Anytime you see somebody just viciously talking about groups of people that they view as oppressors, because those people that are viciously ranting may not realize that they, are capable of doing the worst possible things. Because honestly, I mean, I don't know about you, but like I said when I was watching that clip, I said, you know, this sounds like today, where there are people, particularly certain political leaders, predominantly on the left, that go to certain people that have had disadvantages in life or who have just simply not made much of themselves, and they say, no, it's not your fault, it's this other class of people's fault, and you should be angry about them, and that other class of people needs to be rooted out. You know, the rhetoric of the past is making itself known today, and you know, when we look at social media and that sort of thing, how there's bannings of people who honestly are not white supremacist or far right at all, but who simply just don't toe the left wing line. You know, it's very dangerous. You know, virtual totalitarianism, this kind of cancel culture stuff that we see, that could bleed over into physical reality, as it did regarding the kulaks. And I certainly hope that day never comes. But it's something to keep in mind. Victimhood talk is really, it doesn't benefit anyone, even if the people that are speaking have been legitimately victimized. I don't think it's a good thing to preach on a macro scale, and I don't think Dr. Peterson would think that it would be a good thing to preach on a macro scale either. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, those are my thoughts on the clip. But now I want to know, what did you think of the video? Did you like it? Did you hate it? What did you think of what I said about it? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Leave whatever thoughts and comments you may have in the comment section below. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, if you liked this video, please like it and subscribe. Tell your friends about the channel. And do your best to not be a victim, even if you have been harmed by others or society as a whole. And with that, I bid you a farewell and goodbye. And yeah, see you soon.